Les Misérables. Volume 1. Fantine. Book 4th. To confide is sometimes to deliver into a person's power. Chapter 1. One mother meets another mother. There was at Montfermeil, near Paris, during the first quarter of this century, a sort of cook-shop which no longer exists. This cook-shop was kept by some people named Thenardiers, husband and wife. It was situated in Boulanger Lane. Over the door was a board nailed flat against the wall. Upon this board was painted something which resembled a man carrying another man on his back, the latter wearing the big gilt epaulettes of a general, with large silver stars. Red spots represented blood. The rest of the picture consisted of smoke and probably represented a battle. Below ran this inscription: "At the sign of Sergeant of Waterloo, au Sergeant de Waterloo." Nothing is more common than a cart or a truck at the door of a hostelry. Nevertheless, the vehicle, or, to speak more accurately, the fragment of a vehicle which encumbered the street in front of the cook-shop of the Sergeant of Waterloo, one evening in the spring of 1818, would certainly have attracted by its mass the attention of any painter who had passed that way. It was the fore-carriage of one of those trucks which are used in wooden tracts of country and which serve to transport thick planks and the trunks of trees. This fore-carriage was composed of a massive iron axle-tree with a pivot, into which was fitted a heavy shaft and which was supported by two huge wheels. The whole thing was compact, overwhelming, and misshapen. It seemed like the gun carriage of an enormous cannon. The ruts of the road bestowed on the wheels, the fellies, the hub, the axle, and the shaft, a layer of mud, a hideous yellowish daubing hue, tolerably like that with which people are fond of ornamenting cathedrals. The wood was disappearing under mud, and the iron beneath rust. Under the axle-tree hung, like drapery, a huge chain worthy of some Goliath of a convict. This chain suggested not the beams which it was its office to transport, but the mastodons and mammoths which it might have served to harness. It had the air of the galleys, but of cyclopean and superhuman galleys, and it seemed to have been detached from some monster. Homer would have bound Polyphemus with it, and Shakespeare Caliban. Why was that fore-carriage of a truck in that place in the street? In the first place, to encumber the street. Next, in order that it might finish the process of rusting. There is a throng of institutions in the old social order which one comes across in this fashion as one walks about outdoors, and which have no other reasons for existence than the above. The centre of the chain swung very near the ground in the middle, and in the loop, as in the rope of a swing, there were seated and grouped on that particular evening, in exquisite interlacement, two little girls, one about 2 years and a half old, the other 18 months, the younger in the arms of the other. A handkerchief, cleverly knotted about them, prevented their falling out. A mother had caught sight of that frightful chain and had said, "Come, there's a plaything for my children." The two children, who were dressed prettily and with some elegance, were radiant with pleasure. One would have said that they were two roses amid old iron. Their eyes were a triumph. Their fresh cheeks were full of laughter. One had chestnut hair, the other brown. Their innocent faces were two delighted surprises. A blossoming shrub which grew near wafted to the passers-by perfumes which seemed to emanate from them. The children of 18 months displayed her pretty little bare stomach with the chaste indecency of childhood. Above and around these two delicate heads, all made of happiness and steeped in light, the gigantic fore-carriage, black with rust, almost terrible, all entangled in curves and wild angles, rose in a vault like the entrance of a cavern. A few paces apart, crouching down upon the threshold of the hostelry, the mother, not a very prepossessing woman, by the way, though touching at that moment, was swinging the two children by means of a long cord, watching them carefully, for fear of accidents, with that animal and celestial expression which is peculiar to maternity. At every backward and forward swing, the hideous links emitted a strident sound which resembled a cry of rage. The little girls were in ecstasies. The setting sun mingled in this joy, and nothing could be more charming than this caprice of chance which had made of a chain of Titans the swing of cherubim. As she rocked her little ones, the mother hummed in a discordant voice a romance then celebrated. "It must be," said a warrior. Her song and the contemplation of her daughters prevented her hearing and seeing what was going on in the street. In the meantime, someone had approached her as she was beginning the first couplet of the romance, and suddenly she heard a voice saying very near her ear, "You have 2 beautiful children there, madame." "To be fair and tender, Imogen," replied the mother, continuing her romance. Then she turned her head. A woman stood before her, a few paces distant. This woman also had a child, which she carried in her arms. She was carrying in addition a large carpet-bag which seemed very heavy. This woman's child was one of the most divine creatures that it is possible to behold. It was a girl 2 or 3 years of age. She could have entered into competition with the 2 other little ones so far as the coquetry of her dress was concerned. She wore a cap of fine linen, ribbons on her bodice, and Valenciennes lace on her cap. The folds of her skirt were raised so as to permit a view of her white, firm, and dimpled leg. She was admirably rosy and healthy. The little beauty inspired a desire to take a bite from the apples of her cheeks. Of her eyes nothing could be known except that they must be very large and that they had magnificent lashes. She was asleep. She slept with that slumber of absolute confidence peculiar to her age. The arms of mothers are made of tenderness. In them children sleep profoundly. As for the mother, her appearance was sad and poverty-stricken. She was dressed like a working woman who is inclined to turn into a peasant again. She was young. Was she handsome? Perhaps, but in that attire it was not apparent. Her hair, a golden lock of which had escaped, seemed very thick, but was severely concealed beneath an ugly, tight, close, nun-like cap tied under the chin. A smile displays beautiful teeth when one has them, but she did not smile. Her eyes did not seem to have been dry for a very long time. She was pale. She had a very weary and rather sickly appearance. She gazed upon her daughter asleep in her arms with the air peculiar to a mother who has nursed her own child. A large blue handkerchief, such as the invalids use, was folded into a fichu and concealed her figure clumsily. Her hands were sunburnt and all dotted with freckles. Her forefinger was hardened and lacerated with the needle. She wore a cloak of coarse brown woolen stuff, a linen gown, and coarse shoes. It was Fantine. It was Fantine, but difficult to recognize. Nevertheless, on scrutinizing her attentively, it was evident that she still retained her beauty. A melancholy fold, which resembled the beginning of irony, wrinkled her right cheek. As for her toilette, that aerial toilette of muslin and ribbons, which seemed made of mirth, of folly, and of music, full of bells, and perfumed with lilacs, had vanished like that beautiful and dazzling hoar frost, which is mistaken for diamonds in the sunlight. It melts and leaves the branch quite black. 10 months had elapsed since the pretty farce. What had taken place during those 10 months? It can be divined. After abandonment, straitened circumstances, Fantine had immediately lost sight of Favourite, Zéphine, and Dahlia. The bond once broken on the side of the men, it was loosed between the women. They would have been greatly astonished had anyone told them a fortnight later that they had been friends. There no longer existed any reason for such a thing. Fantine had remained alone. The father of her child gone. Alas, such ruptures are irrevocable. She found herself absolutely isolated, minus the habit of work and plus the taste for pleasure. Drawn away by her liaison with Ptolemy to disdain the pretty trade which she knew, she had neglected to keep her market open. It was now closed to her. She had no resource. Fantine barely knew how to read and did not know how to write. In her childhood she had only been taught to sign her name. She had a public letter writer indite an epistle to Ptolemy, then a second, then a third. Ptolemy replied to none of them. Fantine heard the gossips say, as they looked at her child, "Who takes those children seriously? One only shrugs one's shoulders over such children." Then she thought of Ptolemy, who had shrugged his shoulders over his child, and who did not take that innocent being seriously, and her heart grew gloomy toward that man. But what was she to do? She no longer knew to whom to apply. She committed a fault, but the foundation of her nature, as will be remembered, was modesty and virtue. She was vaguely conscious that she was on the verge of falling into distress and of gliding into a worse state. Courage was necessary. She possessed it and held herself firm. The idea of returning to her native town of M occurred to her. There someone might possibly know her and give her work. Yes, but it would be necessary to conceal her fault. In a confused way she perceived the necessity of a separation which would be more painful than the first one. Her heart contracted, but she took her resolution. Fantine, as we shall see, had the fierce bravery of life. She had already valiantly renounced finery, had dressed herself in linen, and had put all her silks, all her ornaments, all her ribbons, and all her laces on her daughter, the only vanity which was left to her, and a holy one it was. She sold all that she had, which produced for her 200 francs. Her little debts paid, she had only about 80 francs left. At the age of 22, on a beautiful spring morning, she quitted Paris, bearing her child on her back. Anyone who had seen these two pass would have had pity on them. This woman had, in all the world, nothing but her child, and the child had, in all the world, no one but this woman. Fantine had nursed her child, and this had tired her chest, and she coughed a little. We shall have no further occasion to speak of Monsieur Félix Tholomyès. Let us confine ourselves to saying that 20 years later, under King Louis-Philippe, he was a great provincial lawyer, wealthy and influential, a wise elector, and a very severe juryman. He was still a man of pleasure. Towards the middle of the day, after having from time to time, for the sake of resting herself, travelled for 3 or 4 sous a league in what was then known as the Petite Voiture des Environs de Paris, the little suburban coach service, Fantine found herself at Montfermeil in the Allée Boulangère. As she passed the Thenardier hostelry, the 2 little girls, blissful in the monster swing, had dazzled her in a manner, and she had halted in front of that vision of joy. Charms exist. These 2 little girls were a charm to this mother. She gazed at them in much emotion. The presence of angels is an announcement of paradise. She thought that, above this inn, she beheld the mysterious Here of Providence. These 2 little creatures were evidently happy. She gazed at them, she admired them, in such emotion that at the moment when their mother was recovering her breath between 2 couplets of her song, she could not refrain from addressing to her the remark which we have just read. "You have 2 pretty children, madame." The most ferocious creatures are disarmed by caresses bestowed on their young. The mother raised her head and thanked her, and bade the wayfarer sit down on the bench at the door, she herself being seated on the threshold. The 2 women began to chat. "My name is Madame Thenardier," said the mother of the 2 little girls. "We keep this inn." Then, her mind still running on her romance, she resumed, humming between her teeth, "It must be so, I am a knight, I am off to Palestine." This Madame Thenardier was a sandy-complexioned woman, thin and angular, the type of the soldier's wife in all its unpleasantness, and what was odd, with a languishing air which she owed to her perusal of romances. She was a simpering but masculine creature. Old romances produce that effect when rubbed against the imagination of cook-shop woman. She was still young, she was barely 30. If this crouching woman had stood upright, her lofty stature and her frame of a perambulating colossus suitable for fairs might have frightened the traveller at the outset, troubled her confidence, and disturbed what caused what we have to relate to vanish. A person who is seated instead of standing erect, destinies hang upon such a thing as that. The traveller told her story with slight modifications. That she was a working woman, that her husband was dead, that her work in Paris had failed her, and that she was on her way to seek it elsewhere, in her own native parts, that she had left Paris that morning on foot, that, as she was carrying her child and felt fatigued, she had got into the Villemobile coach when she met it, that from the Villemobile she had come to Montfermeil on foot, that the little one had walked a little, but not much, because she was so young, and that she had been obliged to take her up, and the jewel had fallen asleep. At this word she bestowed on her daughter a passionate kiss which woke her. The child opened her eyes, great blue eyes like her mother's, and looked at what? Nothing, with that serious and sometimes severe air of little children, which is a mystery of their luminous innocence in the presence of our twilight of virtue. One would say that they feel themselves to be angels, and that they know us to be men." Then the child began to laugh, and although the mother held fast to her, she slipped to the ground with the unconquerable energy of a little being which wished to run. All at once she caught sight of the two others in the swing, stopped short, and put out her tongue in a sign of admiration. Mother Thenardier released her daughters, made them descend from the swing, and said, "Now, amuse yourselves, all three of you." Children become acquainted quickly at that age, and at the expiration of a minute the little Thenardiers were playing with the newcomer at making holes in the ground, which was an immense pleasure. The newcomer was very gay. The goodness of the mother is written in the gaiety of the child. She had seized a scrap of wood which served her for a shovel, and energetically dug a cavity big enough for a fly. The grave digger's business becomes a subject for laughter when performed by a child. The two women pursued their chat. "What is your little one's name?" "Cosette." For Cosette, read Euphrasie. The child's name was Euphrasie, but out of Euphrasie the mother had made Cosette, by that sweet and graceful instinct of mothers, and of the populace which changes Josepha into Pepita and Françoise into Silette. It is a sort of derivative which deranges and disconcerts the whole science of etymologists. We have known a grandmother who succeeded in turning Theodore into Gon. How old is she? She's going on 3. That is the age of my eldest. In the meantime, the 3 little girls were grouped in an attitude of profound anxiety and blissfulness. An event had happened. A big worm had emerged from the ground, and they were afraid, and they were in ecstasies over it. Their radiant brows touched each other. One would have said there were 3 heads in one aureole. "How easily children get acquainted at once!" exclaimed Mother Thenardier. "One would swear that they were 3 sisters." This remark was probably the spark which the other mother had been waiting for. She seized the Thenardier's hand, looked at her fixedly, and said, "Will you keep my child for me?" The Thenardier made one of those movements of surprise which signify neither assent nor refusal. Cosette's mother continued, "You see, I cannot take my daughter to the country. My work will not permit it. With a child one can find no situation. People are ridiculous in the country. It was the good God who caused me to pass your inn. When I caught sight of your little one, so pretty, so clean, and so happy, it overwhelmed me. I said, 'Here is a good mother. That is just the thing that will make 3 sisters. And then it will not be long before I return. Will you keep my child for me?" "I must see about it," replied the Thenardier. "I will give you 6 francs a month." Here a man's voice called from the depths of the cook-shop. "Not for less than 7 francs, and 6 months paid in advance." 6 times 7 makes 42, said the Thenardier. "I will give it," said the mother. "And 15 francs in addition for preliminary expenses," added the man's voice. "Total 57 francs, said Madame Thenardier, and she hummed vaguely with these figures. "It must be," said a warrior. "I will pay it," said the mother. "I have 80 francs. I shall have enough left to reach the country by travelling on foot. I shall earn money there, and as soon as I have a little I will return for my darling." The man's voice resumed. "The little one has an outfit?" "That is my husband," said the Thenardier. "Of course she has an outfit, the poor treasure. I understood perfectly that it was your husband. And a beautiful outfit, too. A senseless outfit, everything by the dozen, and silk gowns like a lady. It is here in my carpet-bag." "You must hand it over," struck in the man's voice again. "Of course I shall give it to you," said the mother. "It would be very queer if I were to leave my daughter quite naked." The master's face appeared. "That's good," said he. The bargain was concluded. The mother passed the night at the inn, gave up her money and left her child, fastened her carpet-bag once more, now reduced in volume by the removal of the outfit, and light henceforth, and set out on the following morning, intending to return soon. People arrange such departures tranquilly, but they are despairs. A neighbour of the Thenardiers met this mother as she was setting out, and came back with the remark, "I've just seen a woman crying in the street so that it was enough to rend your heart." When Cosette's mother had taken her departure, the man said to the woman, "That will serve you to pay my note for 110 francs which falls due tomorrow. I lacked 50 francs. Do you know that I should have had a bailiff and a protest after me? You played the mousetrap nicely with your young ones." "Without suspecting it," said the woman. Chapter 2. First sketch of two unprepossessing figures. The mouse which had been caught was a pitiful specimen, but the cat rejoices even over a lean mouse. Who were these Thenardiers? Let us say a word or two of them now. We will complete the sketch later on. These beings belong to that bastard class composed of coarse people who have been successful and of intelligent people who have descended in the scale which is between the class called middle and the class denominated as inferior, and which combines some of the defects of the second with nearly all the vices of the first, without possessing the generous impulse of the working man nor the honest order of the bourgeois. They were of those dwarfed natures which, if a dull fire chances to warm them up, easily become monstrous. There was in the woman a substratum of the brute, and in the man the material for a blackguard. Both were susceptible, in the highest degree, of the sort of hideous progress which is accomplished in the direction of evil. There exist crab-like souls which are continually retreating towards the darkness, retrograding in life rather than advancing, employing experience to augment their deformity, growing incessantly worse, and becoming more and more impregnated with an ever-augmenting blackness. This man and woman possessed such souls. Thenardier in particular was troublesome for a physiognomist. One can only look at some men to distrust them, for one feels that they are dark in both directions. They are uneasy in the rear and threatening in front. There is something of the unknown about them. One can no more answer for what they have done than for what they will do. The shadow which they bear in their glance denounces them. For merely hearing them utter a word or seeing them make a gesture, one obtains a glimpse of sombre secrets in their past and of sombre mysteries in their future. This Thenardier, if he himself was to be believed, had been a soldier, a sergeant, he said. He had probably been through the campaign of 1815, and had even conducted himself with tolerable valour, it would seem. We shall see later on how much truth there was in this. The sign of his hostelry was in an allusion to one of his feats of arms. He had painted it himself, for he knew how to do a little of everything, and badly. It was at the epoch when the ancient classical romance, which, after having been Clélie, was no longer anything but Lodoïska, still noble, but ever more and more vulgar, having fallen from Mademoiselle de Scudéry to Madame Bournon-Malarme, and from Madame de Lafayette to Madame Barthélemy Hadot, was setting the loving hearts of the portresses of Paris aflame, and even ravaging the suburbs to some extent. Madame Thenardier was just intelligent enough to read this sort of books. She lived on them. In them she drowned what brains she possessed. This had given her, when very young, and even a little later, a sort of pensive attitude towards her husband, a scamp of a certain depth, a ruffian lettered to the extent of the grammar, coarse and fine at one and the same time, but, so far as sentimentalism was concerned, given to the perusal of Pigault Lebrun, and, in what concerns the sex, as he said in his jargon, a downright unmitigated lout. His wife was 12 or 15 years younger than he was. Later on, when her hair, arranged in a romantically drooping fashion, began to grow grey, when the Maghera began to be developed from the Pamela, the female Thenardier was nothing but a coarse, vicious woman who had dabbled in stupid romances. Now, one cannot read nonsense with impunity. The result was that her eldest daughter was named Éponine. As for the younger, the poor little thing came near being called Gulnare. I know not what diversion effected by a romance of Ducray de Monil she owed the fact that she merely bore the name of Azelma. However, we will remark by the way, everything was not ridiculous and superficial in that curious epoch to which we are alluding, and which may be designated as the anarchy of baptismal names. By the side of this romantic element which we have just indicated, there is the social symptom. It is not rare for the net-herd's boy nowadays to bear the name of Arthur, Alfred, or Alphonse, and for the Vicomte, if there are still any Vicomtes, to be called Thomas, Pierre, or Jacques. This displacement, which places the elegant name on the plebeian and the rustic name on the aristocrat, is nothing else than an eddy of equality. The irresistible penetration of the new inspiration is there as everywhere else. Beneath this apparent discord, there is a great and profound thing. The French Revolution. Chapter 3. The Lark. It is not all in all sufficient to be wicked in order to prosper. The cook-shop was in a bad way. Thanks to the traveller's 57 francs, Thenardier had been able to avoid a protest and to honour his signature. On the following month they were again in need of money. The woman took Cosette's outfit to Paris and pawned it at the pawnbroker's for 60 francs. As soon as that sum was spent, the Thenardiers grew accustomed to look on the little girl merely as a child whom they were caring for out of charity, and they treated her accordingly. As she had no longer any clothes, they dressed her in the cast-off petticoats and chemises of the Thenardier brats, that is to say, in rags. They fed her on what all the rest had left, a little better than the dog, a little worse than the cat. Moreover, the cat and the dog were her habitual table companions. Cosette ate with them under the table from a wooden bowl similar to theirs. The mother, who had established herself, as we shall see later on, at M/M, wrote, or more correctly caused to be written, a letter every month that she might have news of her child. The Thenardiers replied invariably, "Cosette is doing wonderfully well." At the expiration of the first 6 months, the mother sent 7 francs for the 7th month, and continued her remittances with tolerable regularity from month to month. The year was not completed when Thenardier said, "A fine favour she is doing us, in sooth. What does she expect us to do with her 7 francs? And he wrote to demand 12 francs. The mother, whom they had persuaded into the belief that her child was happy and was coming on well, submitted and forwarded the 12 francs. Certain natures cannot love on the one hand without hating on the other. Mother Thenardier loved her 2 daughters passionately, which caused her to hate the stranger. It is sad to think that the love of a mother can possess villainous aspects. Little as was the space occupied by Cosette, it seemed to her as though it were taken from her own, and that the little child diminished the air which her daughters breathed. This woman, like many women of her sort, had a load of caresses and a burden of blows and injuries to dispense each day. If she had not had Cosette, it is certain that her daughters, idolized as they were, would have received the whole of it, but the stranger did them the service to divert the blows to herself. Her daughters received nothing but caresses. Cosette could not make a motion which did not draw down upon her head a heavy shower of violent blows and unmerited chastisement. The sweet, feeble being, who should not have understood anything of this world or of God, incessantly punished, scolded, ill-used, beaten, and seeing beside her 2 little creatures like herself who lived in a ray of dawn. Madame Thenardier was vicious with Cosette. Éponine and Azelma were vicious. Children at that age are only copies of their mother. The size is smaller, that is all. A year passed, then another. The people in the village said, "Those Thenardiers are good people, they are not rich, and that they are bringing up a poor child who was abandoned on their hands." They thought that Cosette's mother had forgotten her. In the meanwhile, Thenardier, having learned, it is impossible to say by what obscure means, that the child was probably a bastard, and that the mother could not acknowledge it, exacted 15 francs a month, saying that the creature was growing and eating, and threatening to send her away. "Let her not bother me," he exclaimed, "or I'll fire her brat right into the middle of her secrets. I must have an increase." The mother paid the 15 francs. From year to year the child grew, and so did her wretchedness. As long as Cosette was little, she was the scapegoat of the 2 other children. As soon as she began to develop a little, that is to say, before she was even 5 years old, she became the servant of the household. 5 years old, the reader will say. That is not probable. Alas, it is true. Social suffering begins at all ages. Have we not recently seen the trial of a man named Dumoulin, an orphan turned bandit, who, from the age of 5, as the official documents state, being alone in the world, worked for his living and stole? Cosette was made to run on errands, to sweep the rooms, the courtyard, the street, to wash the dishes, to even carry burdens. The Thenardiers consider themselves all the more authorized to behave in this manner, since the mother, who was still at M sur M, had become irregular in her payments. Some months she was in arrears. If this mother had returned to Montfermeil at the end of these 3 years, she would not have recognized her child. Cosette, so pretty and rosy on her arrival in that house, was now thin and pale. She had an indescribably uneasy look. "The sly creature," said the Thenardiers. Injustice had made her peevish, and misery had made her ugly. Nothing remained to her except her beautiful eyes, which inspired pain, because, large as they were, it seemed as though one beheld in them a still larger amount of sadness. It was a heart-breaking thing to see this poor child, not yet 6 years old, shivering in the winter in her old rags of linen, full of holes, sweeping the street before daylight, with an enormous broom in her tiny red hands, and a tear in her great eyes. She was called the Lark in the neighbourhood. The populace, who are fond of these figures of speech, had taken a fancy to bestow this name on this trembling, frightened, and shivering little creature, no bigger than a bird, who was awake every morning before anyone else in the house or the village, and was always in the street or the fields before daybreak. Only the little Lark never sang.